On this episode of Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, Mr. Mayo Bartlett Esq, civil rights attorney, discusses reallocation of funding and other possible solutions to changing the culture of policing in the United States. This episode originally aired November 18th, 2020.
Ah, man, it is so good. You know, I am loving what Race Talk is doing and what we've been doing. And this is it couldn't be happening without you. And we've been having some really good guests on, and that also includes today's guest, which is Mr. Mayo Bartlett Esquire. Mr. Bartlett is a former Westchester County prosecutor who has been recognized as a super lawyer. I want to ask what that's about, and selected as one of the top 100 trial lawyers by the National Trial Lawyers. He has been a litigator for more than 26 years. Our litigation lawyers have decades of trial experience. So if a trial is the best way to reach your desired outcome, our experienced litigators will not hesitate to request a trial before a judge or jury. As a Westchester criminal defense lawyer and a former Westchester County prosecutor, Mr. Bartlett is a criminal defense lawyer and a civil rights trial attorney who has extensive experience in criminal law in Westchester County. He has practiced law in almost all of the more than 40 Westchester County jurisdictions, and he has built relationships with the local police and prosecutors. Mr. Bartlett has received 4 AVVO Client's Choice Awards for his work as a criminal defense attorney, white-collar defense attorney, driving while intoxicated defense attorney, and as a civil rights lawyer. Mr. Bartlett appears almost every week on a legal panel featured on Richard French Live, which is available on WRNN. The show is taped live every Wednesday from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. and airs throughout New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, including the 5 boroughs of New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, the Washington, D.C. metro area, Dallas, Houston, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So it is my honor to introduce to Race Talk with Lane and Eugene, Mr. Mayo Bartlett. Good day, sir.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to our conversation. And I have to thank you, and especially for those of you who are not in the area, I think that it's one of the benefits of being able to convene remotely is that we don't have that geographical limitation anymore, so we can share ideas and hear what's happening all around the world. I'm a former prosecutor. I grew up in Greenburgh, which is not far from White Plains. Went to Woodlands High School. I went to Syracuse University undergraduate. And I thought I was going to become an environmental attorney because I thought that would be the best way to help the most people. And then in 1992, I realized that was not apparently the objective, that most environmental firms were helping big business, big oil, mostly, get away with with dumping their toxins in the water. And I didn't really want to do that. So I ended up working for the Westchester County DA's office under Carl Vergari. And in law school, I never thought I wanted to be involved in criminal law. Didn't think I wanted to be a litigator. And so I guess that's a lesson in, we make plans and then, and then greater forces seem to intervene and we end up doing other things. And to make a long story shorter, I ended up in the DA's office, did not fill out the pass for the parking pass because I didn't think I'd be there long enough to actually get the pass. I thought I would stay for 3 years because that was the unwritten commitment. And I ended up staying 11 years. And I stayed 11 years because I met a lot of really great people, but also I found that we needed, in my estimation, good people in every aspect of criminal justice as we do in anything else. And I saw quite a bit, had occasion to work with a lot of outstanding attorneys and great judges. And we started to basically begin restorative justice before it was fashionable in New York, at least I'll say, because elsewhere it had been implemented quite well and very successfully. But in New York, it was somewhat new for us to consider that, maybe we don't look at a criminal transgression as something that is a permanent disability for a person, that we can look at why did it happen. And sometimes we could look at a person, for instance, who has 103 convictions. And yet, as we look at all of those convictions for this person who was in his late 40s, none of them were violent. Every conviction was a petty larceny or a misdemeanor drug possession. So you could really kind of get the gist of what was going on in that person's life by looking at that rap sheet. It told you that this is a person struggling with addiction, and that when they didn't have the money to buy their drugs, that they would steal small things and try to sell that to get the drugs. So instead of spending a lot of time trying to put that person in jail at $100,000+ per year, and only to know that we didn't address the underlying cause, and to have that person come back and be the exact same person, maybe even with additional issues, maybe it made more sense to address the underlying issue and look at why that person was stealing and why they were using drugs, and see if we can help to address that. And it struck me, having prosecuted most of Westchester County, that quite often there were different results if I was in Mount Vernon as opposed to being in Bronxville, which is right across the street. And I would see sometimes the same, and I was the prosecutor, but I would see sometimes the same defense attorney who I saw earlier in the morning in Mount Vernon, who didn't put up too much resistance, all of a sudden have the ability to put up all of this resistance when the person we were prosecuting resembled her, and she could identify more with that person. And I don't say that to tell you that she was a bad person. I mean, we're friends to this day. But I did talk to her about that. And I said, you didn't make these same applications for your client in Mount Vernon. Both of them were charged with unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, which was basically a little less than stealing the car. And they were both kids. Neither one of them was an adult, for the purposes of the criminal justice system. And she made a really good, strong argument for the young man in Bronxville, and a less of one for the young man in Mount Vernon. And then I had to go also to deal with my boss, because I realized that my boss had put in 2 different offers. And the offer for the young man in Mount Vernon was a SCI felony hearing, where he was going to go up and be handled as a felony. And the one for the young man in Bronxville was a local court resolution, which would have meant a misdemeanor or less.
Mr. Bartlett,
Right.
can I just interrupt you for just a moment? So for our listeners, I just want to make sure, for people who do not live in New York, they might be able to tell by your accent, but all of these places that he's mentioning are in New York State. And may I also assume that the person from Mount Vernon is person of color and the person from Bronxville is not? So I just
Yes.
wanted to make that clear to our listening audience. Okay, thank you very much. Please
Absolutely.
continue.
Yes, and in Westchester is one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. Bronxville is one of the wealthiest communities in Westchester. Mount Vernon, which is its sister city, is not. And there's a lot of it's, I believe, 70% minority population, and a lot of poverty in Mount Vernon. And so I, confronted my boss and said, look, I think that these cases are identical. We need to revisit it, and we need to have the same outcome. And at that point, he elevated them both to felonies, which bothered me, because I realized that once it got out of my hands, somebody above me would have reduced it for the young man in Bronxville anyway. So, so I didn't get a chance to follow what ultimately happened, because in Westchester, we didn't have vertical prosecution. That being said, it was an eye-opener. It allowed me to look at how we treat people and what the disparity is based upon race, and also what the disparity is based upon income. And if you look at the Flint, Michigans of the world, poor people suffer greatly in one of the wealthiest nations in the world, no matter where they are. They drink water that is not healthy. They're subjected to all kinds of toxins environmentally, but also other types of toxins which enter the body, physically, but mentally and spiritually. And after we expose them to these things, then we like to have this false notion that everybody pulls themselves up from their bootstraps. And, it's very difficult to do that, in particular when you don't have boots in the first place. So I look at, the different administrations, and right now we're coming out of the Trump administration. But I try to be objective, and I try to be fair. And looking at Flint, Michigan, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed under the Trump administration in 4 years, hasn't changed under Obama's administration in 8 years, or under the Clinton administration and before that. So the likelihood is it won't change now. So a little bit about my background. My mother is from West Virginia, okay, and she's from McDowell County, a small town called Keystone, which was the capital of coal country back in its day, and it was a booming city in its day. It had almost 100,000 people living there, in very small geographic area, but everybody was a miner. And my grandfather, her father, was a coal miner, so I'm the son of a coal miner's daughter. My father and my grandfather was a coal miner, but my grandmother was a teacher. Now both of them had college degrees back then, which was not the norm. But you couldn't make any money teaching, so my grandfather was a coal miner, as was his brother-in-law. He died in his early 50s. I was maybe 2 years old. My sister hadn't yet been born. My great uncle suffered mightily and died 20 years later of black lung and went through excruciating pain. On my father's side, my father's parents were from North Carolina, my grandfather and my grandmother from Philadelphia, and they were domestic workers. And my father worked for the IRS. And when we have conversations about race, it's important to understand that we have done a great job of PR in our country talking about what we are. And quite often it's not accurate. So when you look at what the founders stated that white men who were landowners could vote. That means that probably none of us on this call would have been able to vote, although maybe somebody's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson or something like that. But short of that, it wasn't you owned a condominium or you had a 1/4 acre lot or you had a nice 4 or 5 acre lot with a horse ranch on it. That's nice, but that wasn't enough for you to be able to vote. You basically owned villages and towns, and you were one of the oligarchs, more or less. And even then, they didn't trust those people to make good decisions, so we had the Electoral College so you could overturn their decisions if we thought they were wrong. But no women could vote until very recently. People of African descent were property, viewed as 3/5 of a human being. And if that's what's in our Constitution, it sort of tells the story of what grows from there. As I like to say, I can't cut a clipping of a root and give it to you, and I know that root is poison ivy, and I sell it to you as being roses, because it's not going to be a rose no matter how much you want it to be. It's going to be poison ivy. Now, you can nurture that poison ivy. It may be good, strong poison ivy, but it's not going to become a rose bush.
So could I stop you again for a minute? So I just wanted you to know, I want to make sure you have some background as well. So we have definitely talked about the progression and the history of policing and the policing culture. So I just want to let you know that we have done some work on that, and I'm loving what you're giving the background. But I also want to let everybody know that when we talked about you coming to talk about defunding the police, you did say to me, well, I'm not a big fan of defunding the police, but what I would like to talk about is ways that we can reallocate funding that would help us to police more equitably, right?
Wonderful.
So yeah, so continue, and I just want to ensure our viewers that we will be getting to that.
Okay, and I can move right into that now. One of the things that we don't address is, who are the police? How are they selected? How do they police? What is the training? What happens after they come out of the academy? And what are the policies set by the hierarchy in the police department and sometimes in the municipality itself, your mayors, your town supervisors, village managers, things like that. And, we yesterday were discussing 2 cases. There were Zoom bombs where, similar to what we're doing right now, someone came in a synagogue and yelled anti-Semitic slurs and had photos of Nazis, things like that. And both of them were investigated. And different results, but there was an investigative effort. There was another recently in Edgemont High School, which is a village in the town of, well, it's not a village, it's part of the town of Greenburgh, which is where I'm from in Westchester, New York, where there was the Zoom bombing, and what happened was it was anti-Black, and the N-word was used a lot, along a lot of racial slurs. There was no investigation into that.
I didn't hear the last couple of sentences. It sounded pretty garbled. I don't know if anyone else
Okay. I'm sorry. It was an anti-African American slurs were used, the N-word, a host of other things about, Black people that were derogatory. And there was no investigation at all.
As opposed to when it was anti-Semitic, which was
Yes.
investigated. Yeah.
Yes. And I don't use, the fact that it was anti-Semitic to mean anything other than the police determine what gets investigated. And if you're marginalized in your community, then there's a chance that your transgressions against you may not be taken as seriously, may not receive the same care, may not be, handled that way. And you can just look at Dylan Roof with the murder of the people in the church down in Georgia. Well, he got bail. He was treated pretty well. He had a nice meal and everything. And I'm not for the abuse of anybody, don't get me wrong. However, there are people, George Floyd lost his life over the possible passing of a counterfeit $20 bill. So how do we have such different treatment? How do we have bail set that's the equivalent of bail that people who simply sold drugs would get in that same community? So it makes you have to stop and look at whether there's equity and equality in the system. And so one of the things we're looking at right now is, how do we recruit police? What are the metrics? Is it important that a police officer be able to do 100 push-ups and sit-ups, or does it not mean so much? Because the reality is, once you get out of the academy, you're probably not doing that anyway. And we don't expect you to chase down a car or to hold somebody with superhuman strength. You have a radio, and the beauty of the police department is that you have, brothers and sisters that work with you. So you can radio ahead, or you can call in for assistance from other communities. So how many people are not able to come onto the force because they can't pass that portion of it? How many don't pass the test? Does the test accurately reflect what we need to be good police officers? And where do we recruit? So there's a debate right now about SROs, whether we should have school resource officers. And now there's a movement by some people to one, defund the police, number two, to do away with police altogether, to abolish the police. I'm not in favor of either of those. And I met with a police reform group the other day, and there was a suggestion that the police should just let people commit misdemeanors and not address that. And because people go to jail and they get sick and they die of COVID. And number one, there was a misunderstanding, because you don't go to jail for misdemeanors for the most part anymore in New York State after bail reform. Now, you can end up in jail if you're convicted, but even there, it's a big move away from incarcerating people. But the other thing is that I think people don't necessarily understand what a misdemeanor is. A misdemeanor means somebody could come and punch you in your face. And more often than not, the police will tell you that it might be an assault, but they may tell you it's just harassment second degree, which is a violation. So I don't think any of us want to have that happen and let the police just allow that. In New York, if you steal money that's less than $1,000, it's a misdemeanor. I don't think any of us want to have, any of our money stolen on an ongoing basis and not have the police get involved. And I haven't talked to anybody, I've talked to very few people at least, who don't want the police in their community. What I do hear very often is they want the police to be well trained, they want the police to respect them, and they want to be treated as every other citizen is treated. They don't want to be disregarded or treated disrespectfully or abused. And I don't think that's a lot to ask. So toward that end, we have proposed a scheme that would involve licensing the police, where the police would have to carry a license in order to be a police officer, just as a nurse would, or a teacher, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a barber, and in addition to that, that they would have to take a core curriculum for law enforcement, continuing law enforcement education. And that would include de-escalation techniques. It would include training all of the police that come into the police academy with a significant amount of training in terms of how to interact with people with mental health issues. And, I think that it's important that they all receive that training, because you can't assume that they're not going to come in contact with those situations. And it's a disservice to the officers not to have them prepared to be able to de-escalate an encounter or properly handle an encounter with someone who's not in their right mind at the moment. We're looking at requiring them to be mandatory interveners, so that if they see their fellow officers engaged in criminality or misconduct, that it's their duty, their affirmative duty, to intervene. And failure to do so may result in a misdemeanor. But also, failure to do so will come up when you re-up your license. So if you go to reaffirm your license each year, you have to take that course, the courses that involve the de-escalation, mental health issues, and your own well-being as well. You have to have a mental health screening yourself, because we have to understand that police officers may come into the job with the best of intentions. And I tend to think that many of them believe that they're coming into the job with that. Of course, they bring in their bias, as we all do when we enter life, whatever our biases are, and hopefully we're aware of them. And if we're not, hopefully we have friends who help to make us aware. But we all bring that with us. We all bring our baggage. But to what degree is the best officer impacted when that officer encounters tragedy along the way? So for us to expect that officer to do 20 or 25 years and be the exact same person is not, I think, an honest conversation. And when you look at, let's say, for example, the officer that's called to a home and opens the freezer and finds a baby in the freezer, how does that impact that officer? Does that officer have the capability of putting that out of their mind, or are they going to be in a position where, they don't look at people the same way anymore, and that they start to look at everybody with a different lens, and that they're perhaps maybe predisposed to punishing people who have nothing to do with that? So I think that, they should be given their own evaluation. And if it's found that they can no longer continue in their capacity as a police officer, that we have to start looking at models to allow them to retire, based upon that disability. So and I don't think there are going to be a lot of officers that are going to try to take advantage of that.
No.
And to the contrary, most officers I know who probably should step away based upon mental health issues fight very hard to stay on the force.
Well, that was going to be my question.
And if we're going to do that, we should do so in a way that doesn't stigmatize the officer.
Yeah. Well, can I ask a question about that? Can I ask a question about that? So there's a couple of things that come up as you're speaking, right? And you said, well, we proposed. So I have a question about who we is and who you're proposing it to and how long ago, and whether or not you feel that there is a receptive audience, because that blue wall is going to fight you with everything they have, and municipalities are going to say to you, we don't have the money for that, right? There's a lot of things that are going to be put up in front of you. And so I'm wondering how perhaps you could get such things into, legislated into law, so that and then where would that money come from, right? So we're talking about reallocation, right? So if we're going to fund training, what would maybe have to be defunded, do you think? And then I know also that Joe Majak has a question, but if you could just give me a maybe 2-minute answer on that one. I know that's a lot of questions, but.
I think it's a false narrative in terms of what we're able to afford. We afford whatever we want. So when the pandemic had $10 trillion materialized out of the blue and went to Wall Street, and this was at the same time that we were told that Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders were communists because they wanted people to have health care, and that it would cost $1 trillion. So I think we're already able to have funded health care for at least the next 5 years, just based on that 10 trillion that materialized. And the other thing is, most people, I would implore everybody to ask for the budget wherever you live. Find a budget, look at the budget. The budget tells you all you need to know. When you see the budget, it'll tell you what you're paying for. And New York City, for example, is closing in on $1 billion, billion with a B, that they've paid out as a result of police officer misconduct just this year alone. So there's your money. I mean, if you are investing in good officers, then you don't have to worry about paying out all these lawsuits, and you don't have to worry about your community mistrusting all your other officers. So if you train the proper officers, you might have someone who's a wonderful person, but they're not suited to be a police officer. That may be me or one of us or most of us on this call, but it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that that's not your talent. And if you put people in place that are going to do the right thing, and if you change the metrics in terms of how we promote, and if we look at community engagement as a necessity and officers as being ambassadors, not just having one officer who gets along well with the community, but making that a requisite for all of the officers, and having them realize that their job is to not only get along with the community, but to realize that while they're working, they're part of the community, even if you live elsewhere, then we can do that. And I tend to think also, I've been accused of wanting to put too much money in the system and wanting to work with the system. We had a model, for instance, that involved the training, but also where the officers would indemnify the community. So if I'm a police officer and I engage in misconduct and I get sued and the county covers me, then I would have to pay the county back. You know, I should have some responsibility as an officer. And I had some people who pushed back and told me that sounds like spending more money for the police. And then I've had other people who told me I'm a defund the police person. And in the same breath asked me, how are we going to pay for things? So people have a narrative that they want to embrace, and lots of times they don't kind of listen to the conversation. But when I say we, I'm co-chair of the Westchester County Task Force for Police Reform and Reimagining the Police. Now, I'm not here speaking on behalf of that organization. However, we did have Brian Corr from NACOL come in, and we've had a number of great speakers come and present to our group. We've had over 100 meetings, probably more than 200 hours worth of meetings, and that's just things that we did in, one-on-one in person.
Could you clarify who is NACOL?
NACOL is National Association. I have to look now to see what the acronym is. I forget. But Brian Corr is the person who drafted President Obama's report on a task force for 21st century policing. Okay. And he came and met with our accountability working group, and we were very pleased to find that all the things he had recommended we were already doing. And he seemed to be somewhat excited at our prospect. We're looking at having a countywide police civilian complaint review board or police accountability board. And it would allow Westchester County to be the arbiter and the hearing agency and investigative agency for all of the municipalities in Westchester County. And he told us if we were successful, that as things stand right now, to his knowledge, we would be the first county in the United States to do so. Yeah. Now, I think that that's great, but I don't get caught up in us being first or where we are. It's us in Allegheny County in Pennsylvania that are exploring it right now. What I want to do is make sure that we create a model, a framework that removes the ability of an officer to hide behind a collective bargaining agreement, that requires them to have accountability. And I would suggest to you that the officer who knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck probably wouldn't have done that if he was thinking, hey, I'm going to lose my pension and I'm going to get prosecuted. And even if he would have done it, the three other officers wouldn't have let him do that if they thought they might lose their pension too and lose their job too and get prosecuted. So
I'm sorry. So I want to make sure that we open the floor. Let me know when is a good time for us to let people start asking you questions.
This is fine.
Because there's a lot of questions I know I'm seeing.
And how much time do we have today?
Well, we're going to end at 1 o'clock. Okay, so it's 12:33.
Okay. This is a great time to start the give and take.
Okay, very good. I mean, the information you're giving us is fabulous, and I know that people have questions, and I know that's going to allow you to give us more information. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Joe Majak, go ahead and unmute, and then it's Christine is next.
And then after Christina, it'd be Tyrone.
Lovely.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mayo. I'm a citizen of White Plains, New York. 5 minutes ago, I wrote down one question. I've rewritten it 2 times. And now after you mentioned the county civilian review board, I would just love to hear from you. Do you think there's any value in moving forward with any kind of civilian review board if it doesn't have subpoena power? What's the point if it doesn't have? I'd like to hear your view on that and what your position will be on that.
I have virtually never been pro civilian complaint review board for that exact reason, and also because many police departments have bodies that have that name, but they don't have any teeth, don't have any power. What we're proposing would have subpoena power. What we're proposing would be independent of the county executive, but it would certainly be independent of all of the local municipalities. And so it would be transparent, and you would have investigators. We would be able to compel people to come to our body. And what would happen is ultimately at the conclusion of the investigation, if there's a finding of wrongdoing, that finding would be made public. It would be printed. We would submit it and do a press release with that finding. And as things stand right now, under home rule, it would have to go back to the local municipality to impose any disciplinary action. However, I think it's a lot more difficult for a town or village or city to ignore a finding by the county. And at the same time, if we investigate and find no wrongdoing, it's not made public because there's no finding of wrongdoing. So that protects the officer as we would somebody charged with a crime. So only if you're found to have been engaged in wrongdoing. And that's with the understanding that, as always, there are going to be people who engaged in misconduct that are not going to have a finding of wrongdoing because that's just the way things work. And occasionally, I'm sure there may be somebody that didn't, and we're going to find wrongdoing. But we'll put in place all of the safeguards possible to make sure we get it right. And then we're going to propose state legislation to the governor of New York that similar bodies exist in every county, because right now only 50% of the police departments, we have, I believe, 43 police departments in Westchester County, only 50% are accredited, and only 25% of the police departments throughout New York State are accredited. So that's a problem. So you may have a great department and it may be accredited and they may be doing wonderful things in terms of training and protocol, and you can drive outside of your county or within the county, drive to another town and find a police department that's not very professional at all, doesn't have the same standards.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
And God bless you. God bless you for that work, because that is very, very important. And I think the Civilian Review Board, you talked at the beginning about focusing on selecting the right cops. The Civilian Review Board will be a disincentive for a bad cop to want to play in a municipality that won't prosecute them. I know we're short on time. Thank you, Lane.
Thank you. And I wanted to just finish just to address this last point, and it may go through another question. We structured our, Leroy Frazier is my co-chair, and we structured our task force so that we had representation of balanced representation in the 6 working groups. So we have community engagement, we have transparency, we have qualifications and recruitment. Then we also have training and equipment. We have policies and protocol, and we have accountability. And some of you may be familiar with Kenneth Chamberlain Jr. His father was shot and killed by the White Plains Police. I happen to represent his estate in a civil lawsuit against the city of White Plains. But George Latimer is our county executive in Westchester County, and he'd been meeting with the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform now for about three years, maybe a little more. Also, I had drafted an independent prosecutor bill with George Latimer when he was a state senator. So he's a good faith actor. He's really interested in doing the work, and he started our task force before the governor mandated it. He put Kenneth Chamberlain on our task force. Ken is on the accountability working group. Damon Jones is on the policy and protocol working group. And also he just added Detective Clark, who is the whistleblower from Mount Vernon, who provided tapes of his fellow officers engaged in misconduct to the district attorney's office to get them investigated. So I think we have a real body here that's interested. And the other thing is that we've had chiefs of police and commissioners and deputy commissioners who've worked with us. At our last full session of our task force, we had Terry Rayner, who is the deputy commissioner of the Westchester County Department of Public Safety, present and indicate that if officers did not intervene, that they should, that our recommendation would be that there would be criminal charges that they could face. And we also had
Sir, I'm going to interrupt you again, if that's okay. We have so many people here who are not from Westchester County and not even from New York that they're, I want them to get lost in all these names and things, okay? So that's okay. I know we have lots of people who are applauding you from Westchester and many people who are not. So I want to go ahead and let people ask questions if that's okay with you. And we can bring you back on, but okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your flexibility. I'm sorry to keep interrupting you. Christine, go ahead.
Hi, I'm from California, and the county I'm in is extremely conservative. The city I'm in is more progressive and has better training. So when you suggest that the county would be the arbitrator, I was like, oh my God. So how do we ensure that there's good intent with the whole approach that, so that there really is some sort of citizen participation in getting the police to respond to them, and and do the kinds of things you're talking about. So
We always
okay.
are going to run into that, and I view the county or the state as the floor. So there's nothing that stops your municipality from going beyond that.
Okay.
Sometimes it'll require a legislative act, but I think a lot of it's just engagement. And again, we have a lot of our police officers and chiefs who've been very much interested in becoming involved, very supportive of the work we're doing. And they're the ones that sometimes are the spokespeople. They're the ones giving the report. And you'd be amazed how many chiefs say, look, we'd love to be able to get rid of somebody who's a problem in our department, but we can't based on the civil service law. So the licensing would be a way around that. The licensing is a way that you can look at them as you would anyone else. And if you got arrested or you have abused someone, the licensing agency can look at it. That being said, all safeguards are only as good as the people implementing it. I mean, we just looked at a challenge to the certification in Detroit of the ballots, strictly on a partisan, way. And, the people rose up and they undid that. But we have to always be on top of government. If we don't, and if we just assume that government's going to do the job because it's there and that we're free, we won't be for long.
So it's in the numbers. It's in the numbers, just getting people to actually write to their Congress people, or, the more people that come together. Is that what you would say?
Well, it's that, but it's also making sure that you frame the argument. So, I think that when White Plains had an election, one of the biggest issues in the election was whether the French American school was going to be allowed to open. And that was dealing with parking issues and traffic. Okay. And it's back on a golf course. I mean, it really wasn't going to impact that many people, but it was going to impact a few people, and they were very vocal. And that more or less drove the election. And nobody was saying, hey, what is our law enforcement doing? What equipment do they have? So we have to frame it and make sure people understand that that's important, even in terms of framing the conversation. Right now, you have people who tried to run Joe Biden's bus off the road, okay, his campaign bus. And it was applauded by President Trump. And if President Obama had done the same thing, I would have major problems with that, okay? But if we allow that to go on, and we allow things like that to happen, and we don't push back, and we don't frame the conversation differently, and if we allow those people to be framed as the patriots and everybody on this call as activists, well, what does that mean? What are the connotations? If someone hears activist, there's an entire generation of people who don't even listen to what you're talking about at all. They just heard activists and they're against it. They don't know what it means. Somebody else will hear patriot and they don't know that this is the person who blew up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Yeah. So, the narrative is important. Whether we say defund the police as opposed to looking at alternatives, looking at ways, looking at things that should be funded. So for instance, I just left court this morning with a young man who was charged with having a gun. And Westchester County's policy used to be you get a minimum 3.5 years in prison for having a gun, and up to 15 years just for having a gun. But we were able to show who this young man is and what he had been doing, that he had been working every single day, manual labor with his father. He just enrolled in college. He didn't even know what was in the backpack. And so New Rochelle, the city of New Rochelle, now is engaging with an organization that looks at engaging people into the workforce and training people to be able to work in the workforce, whether it's helping them to learn a trade or to go to college, and giving them mentors. And thankfully, they do it before you get into the criminal justice as well, because there are plenty of programs that are there if you're in the system, and not as many when you're not. So those are some of the things that we should be stressing and saying, look, this is what we want. We want to be able to reintegrate our members of society into society. They're going to be part of our community anyway. Let's allow them to make amends. Let's allow them to have a path back toward being a full-fledged member of society, being able to hold the job, being able to go to school. These are some of the things that we have to suggest and get on the agenda.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Tyrone.
Good morning, Council. This is Tyrone. I'm also from California. That's why I say good morning. And I have to say, you're looking awful sharp there. I haven't seen a shirt and tie in 8 months. So
my question picks out all my clothing for me. He tells me what to wear ahead of time.
Smart person. My question is more on a national level. How would you advise the Biden-Harris administration to approach the criminal justice reform commitment that they made, not only black folks, to everybody who voted? So what would you advise them?
I think that you hit it on the head. I think that we lose a lot when we limit things to one group. So if we start saying black folks, like I had somebody the other day say, oh, the police shouldn't even be arresting young black people on misdemeanors because they go to jail and they get COVID. So, but that's, again, it wasn't well thought out at all. You lose a lot of people, number one. Number two, every misdemeanor is not something that's so minor. Some of them are much more significant than felonies. But I think that we have to realize that it's really all of us in this together. So, you know, we always, when we give presentations, highlight our colleagues who are not black, who've suffered at the hands of law enforcement. Jeffrey Descovich is one. He's went to prison for rape and murder he didn't commit when he was 17 years old in Peekskill. And they had DNA evidence which would have suggested that he wasn't involved. And ultimately, Barry Scheck and the Innocence Project helped to have him have his case exonerated. He finished college and just graduated from law school. I would suggest that we look at embrace wholeheartedly restorative justice. And if you do that, and if you call it restorative justice, and if you're mindful of the language, you can phrase it in such a way that nobody could really be against it. So even as we work in the task force, if I'm dealing with a PBA representative or somebody who's going to be resistant to what we're talking about, instead of saying, hey, we need to be able to do this and we need to be able to do that, maybe it's beneficial for me to say, hey, Chief, would it be helpful to you if we did these three things to make it easier for you to be able to address a bad officer in your department? Now, how do you answer no to that? You can't answer no to that. The answer has to be yes. And also it changes sometimes.
Unless you're part of the police union.
Well, he is the chief. We've talked to the head of the police union, and he has to say yes, because if you say no, then you're essentially saying you're in favor of bad officers in your department. So you can't say that. So if you say, hey, are you for justice? Anybody who says no, well, then we know we're dealing with a different person. But anybody who says yes, then let's look at what justice is. And does justice mean that somebody who stole something, for instance, in New York, which is not such a liberal state? We think it is. It's really not at all. One of my professors from law school said, you know, I never realized I was from progressive Mississippi, because in Mississippi, you can get a felony expunged. You can't in New York. So in New York, it stays with you forever. You could be 99, and if you got arrested for a misdemeanor at 19, you have to report that every time you go to get a job or try to get an education. Something's wrong there. So we're working to undo that. But I would suggest that, number one, you have to have stakeholders, but you also need to have buy-in from law enforcement. And there are a lot of chiefs of police out there. There are a lot of police officers who are definitely very much interested in changing this narrative and changing the directive and the dynamic, and who suffer mightily just because they wear a uniform. So when things are going south, they're the ones getting yelled at and having things thrown at them. And they may go home and feel the exact same way. They're not happy either. Their children could also be shot. They're also fearful of the bad officers. So if we engage in that kind of a conversation and have an honest dialogue about what policing should be, have an honest dialogue about how we compensate law enforcement, because some police don't make enough money to live in the community. And so, you know, I think that we have to look at providing houses going up. There should be a set aside so that you can have police live in the community, you know, and you can have your teachers live in the community. People that are essential to your community should be able to live there. They shouldn't travel 4 or 5, you know, counties away, and they shouldn't be working doubles and triple shifts. Well, double shifts, you know, with a break in between another double shift, so they retire with a good amount of money. So these are they're decisions that are going to require us spending money, but at the same time, we spend a ton of money, and most of it that we spend on police departments does not go to the officers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. Thank you for that question, Tyrone. I know, Eugene, you're unmuted. I think you want to jump in, but can we let Leah ask her question? She's had her hand up for quite some time. And then we've got 10 minutes left in the broadcast.
Thank you very much, Mayo. I saw you on a webinar with the New York Civil Liberties Union last month. And my question is about qualified immunity. and holding police officers accountable for misconduct. At that meeting, Sisitsky
Yes.
mentioned that we probably wouldn't be able to get rid of qualified immunity, but a way to get around it is to make municipalities refuse to pay for police misconduct.
Well, I would not suggest that, because you always want to have the municipality pay, because the municipality has the money. And if the municipality, for instance, my suggestion is that we have the municipality pay first, but then we need a model that requires the officers to indemnify. Some people suggest an insurance model, but insurance, you can't insure against an intentional act. So I can't pay insurance and go out and hurt somebody intentionally. It only covers reckless and negligent, and sometimes not even reckless. So I would think that, the officers should know that when you come in, that if you cost money to the city based upon not negligence, if you're driving and you're driving reasonably well and you have a car accident, yeah, we should cover that as the county or the municipality. But if I'm doing 100 miles an hour for no reason with my lights on and I'm not responding to anything, that should be on me. And I should get charged for that if I hurt someone. If I intentionally hurt somebody, yes, the city should pay, or the county or the municipality, but then they should be able to come back to me to get that back. And they can do that by coming back and either garnishing my wages or take it out of my pension. And maybe they don't get the whole thing, but you know what? You get some of it back. And the reality is, if I am an officer and I think that I might lose my pension or my home or my, or part of my salary, it's not attractive for me to be heavy-handed with somebody for no reason.
Right.
So I think that that's a good way to look at it. Unfortunately, the qualified immunity is a creature of the Supreme Court. So there's not much we can do until either there's legislation or else until the court itself changes its ruling, which I don't think it will. And one of the other things we have to look at is gerrymandering and the redistricting that happens all the time, because you look at states like Virginia, for instance, which has gone blue for a number of elections now, which still can't have blue control of the House, of its state government. And I say blue because that's what it happens to be. I don't feel any differently if it was the other way around. I think that the people should be able to have a say. And if it's a Republican community, then a minority of Democrats should not be able to gerrymander the map so that they control it either. I think that that's just not, it's not good governance. And I think that's something that we have to look at. One of the other things we may want to look at right now, it appears that Joe Biden's going to win by more than 6 million votes on the popular vote. 6 million, if you divided that, you could probably have 8 red states, and they wouldn't have 6 million people total. And yet they have 12 senators in those six states, as opposed to a New York City, which has just the 2 senators from all of New York. And those senators have to think about everybody in New York, not just the people in New York City. They think about the red portions of New York as well. So there has to be a model, in my estimation, that more fairly takes into consideration the population. When we're consistently having people elected president with a minority of the vote, it's a problem. I mean, and if you just took it as a sports analogy, the Yankees scored fewer runs, so they're not the World Series champs this year. And we're kind of looking at it as if under the current model, they would be. So I could go fight Mike Tyson and then I get my belt after he knocks me out. I'm the champ.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Leah. So folks, we are short on time. I want to get one more question in, and I want to see whoever raises their hand first will get the question. We have any more questions out there today? No? Okay. Eugene? This has been great, by the way, Mr. Bartlett. Thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
I did see 2 other questions, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I'm looking,
Mary
but who's
Cobb
got
has-
the
Mary Cobb. Mary Cobb raised her hand. And so
Mary
did
Cobb
Pam.
raised a hand. Lane Mary Cobb.
Yeah, okay. Mary Cobb, you raised your hand. Mary Cobb, I think that's Jim Cobb.
Yes.
Go ahead and unmute yourself, Dad. And I know, Mr. Bartlett, I know you know my parents very well. Okay, I don't see him. Eugene, if you see him, unmute him, please. Okay.
And then it looks like Salma Balomo as well.
Yeah, Salma, go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Oh, I really want to hear from your dad, though. Hi, I'm Sama,
Uh,
and can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you.
My legislators are going to listen to a maximum of 3 sentences before they tune out because they're used to me. What are those 3 sentences? Like, what do we need them to know by the end of those 3 sentences to get their attention and create an observable object of change that we expect?
You brought up a great point, and very briefly, sometimes if they're used to you, you may be better off employing a colleague, somebody they don't know, and let that person come in. They'll be more receptive and listen. And in addition, they'll realize it's not just your voice, but there are other people in the community who feel the same way. So we did that frequently when we were talking about the Chamberlain case. And in fact, the narrative was normally the black and brown representatives that got coverage. And we realized that our white colleagues are just as eloquent and are just as interested and invested. So we decided to have them be the only presenters one time. The sad part about that was that News 12 filmed it for about a half hour and never ran the story, but it still is important to be able to do that. So that's what I would suggest you do. And you can ask the questions you were going to ask. Give them a list of 10 things to ask. You can get them all out. And if you can get 4 or 5 more people to come, bring people with you when you go to your city council meeting, but they don't have to arrive with you. Just have them there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, do you have yourself unmuted? Otherwise, I'm going to let Ginny Stillman ask another question.
Well, no, let her ask a question. I wanted to compliment Mayo. I really enjoyed what he had to say. It's great. Okay. And I wanted to know if police in their training are taught anything about de-escalation and the sociological problems in America now.
Yes, they are, and we are codifying it. That's the other thing. Someone had mentioned that before. It has to be codified. It's got to be policy or codified. It can't be by executive order because that can be undone overnight. And we are having ABLE come in right now. We're exploring having ABLE come in, which is in response to the interaction after Katrina in New Orleans. And it's offered active bystander intervention training. So we're going to codify that, and the de-escalation and the duty to intervene is there. And it also embraces officer wellness.
I'm going to follow up on that. Active bystander intervention training.
Yes, and it's a Georgetown model. It came out of Georgetown Law School.
So is that something that we can connect with nationwide and kind of participate in such training?
Absolutely, and I'm going to be meeting with some representatives from ABLE, and if you'd like, we can touch base and maybe they can give a presentation. It might be beneficial.
I think that would be wonderful. Great idea. Thank you. Ginny, go ahead and ask your question, please. We have 2 minutes left.
I have two questions, and you can choose which one you want to answer. You mentioned, Mayo, that only 50% of police departments in Westchester County are accredited. What does this mean? And my second question is, some of us are getting involved with our local community police review for the Executive Order 203. What would be some of the advice you would give us in terms of attending sessions that are open to the community?
I would absolutely, okay, the first question.
We got 1 minute.
What was the first question?
Accreditation, what it means.
Oh, yes. That means that you meet the bare minimum standards that the state imposes. And so we're proposing legislation to require every police department in the state to meet that standard. In terms of the local boards or communities which may not be doing it yet, if you think that you'd like to have your community do it, approach your local elected officials and say, hey, listen, we want to do this. And it's a feather in the cap of your community, and it makes your community much less likely to suffer the fate of communities that don't do this, where you see the community burning later, because there was never a dialogue, never truth and reconciliation. What I think is, it's important that these task forces are structured properly. So you need balance. You don't need just police, but you need people who are not police, who have a background in law enforcement, and are able to look at what it should be. People familiar with the 21st century policing model would be helpful. And it's important to have direct conversations with the elected officials to determine how did they select the people that are on the task force. Because there are communities, I think that as Mr. Coasty said, look, I think you said it, no, maybe I don't remember, but there are communities that have no interest. I think it was one of the ladies who said it, that have no interest. The county doesn't want to do anything. So if it goes to the county, it's going to die on the vine. So it's important to talk to them, let them know you're paying attention and that these are the things that are important. Please share my information. If you have any questions, you can reach me anytime. I'll be happy to talk to you about what we've done, what I think has been effective, what I think we could do better. And I'm happy to hear any suggestions you may have so that we can always continue to improve what we're doing.
I will share your information in a follow-up newsletter, but give it to me now so I can type it in the chat.
Thank you. It's mgb@mayobartlett.com, MayoBartlett.com. And my number is probably the best way to reach me. It's 914-224-3086. And that's just because in the age of COVID, it's all, there's 1,000 emails and, so I don't want to miss it or if it goes to spam. But if you call me and I miss you, I will certainly get right back to you. That's fine. That's
Thank you. I think what I'm going to also ask you as a follow-up is perhaps if you can give me some resources that I can share with these good people in terms of whether there are models for community intervention, talking about NoCal a little bit. So I'm gonna kind of ask you to refer me to some things that would be very helpful in the follow-up. And absolutely, I would talk to you absolutely about finding out if Abel can come and do a presentation. That would be absolutely a dream come true. Thank you so much. Eugene, I would like you to come in and have the last word with our wonderful guest, if you don't mind, before we close out. What happened to my co-host? Okay, well, it's okay. I'll pretend I'm Eugene. This has been absolutely fabulous. We're so grateful for your presence and for you giving us your time, because I can't imagine how busy you are, having been back and forth with you for several weeks. This is wonderful. Certainly, we would love to have you come back, and certainly I will be interacting with you later. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for this opportunity to come into your homes again. If you have questions for Mr. Bartlett, please just send them to me. You can respond to the follow-up and I will make sure that he gets them unless you would like to directly communicate with him. All right, everyone, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.